You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before. My name is Jay Record. This is a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by myself and my father, Jake Record. We're recording this to discuss our favorite show for the benefit of Jake's grandson and my son, Benjamin Jacob Record. But of course, we are recording these and releasing them on YouTube for the general enjoyment of the audience. How are you doing today, Jake?
I'm good, Jay.
Excellent. So, we're going to be looking at an episode that I love a lot. It's one of my favorite episodes of the first season. We're looking at The Battle, which is season 1, episode 8 of Star Trek The Next Generation, which debuted on November 16th, 1987. This is a Ferengi-heavy episode. But, I think it does some interesting things, actually, with the Ferengi species and characters. But before we get started, did you enjoy the episode? And, so far we're about, 8 episodes in?
Yes.
So even though, I should mention, though, on Memory Alpha they say it's 9 episodes. On Netflix it's 8.
But yeah, it depends on whether they count Farpoint as 1 or 2. I think that's the difference.
So, for those at home, we've been counting Farpoint as 1, even though in the official count it's 2. But we'll make sure to make notes and corrections on that for everyone.
Yeah.
But so, what do you think of this episode in terms of a Ferengi episode and just in general?
Well, I think it was I found it just very entertaining. It was a very interesting story about, brought some history into Picard's background as when his, I guess his first command was on the Stargazer 9 years before. And it was just entertaining that way. There wasn't the only heavy kind of philosophical thing that I saw was the comments about revenge in the end.
Oh yeah. And we'll get into that. Yeah. But first thing I kind of wanted to
explain. Just 2 other things is that I think there's constant building of more development of the Picard Beverly Crusher relationship, because in this episode, just like the previous one, especially in this episode, she's the only one that's calling him Jean-Luc.
Well, there's a
in most cases. Then the other thing is that it keeps building up that Wesley Crusher is something special.
Oh yeah.
So that's the only other comments I wanted to make.
Actually, let's touch on Picard and Jean-Luc and Beverly for a second. I think one thing the show has done in this first season has kind of built on. There's both a romantic tension between them that harkens back to before the Enterprise and probably before the Stargazer.
Right.
Like you mentioned in the last episode, Jack Crusher kind of came and interrupted that for Jean-Luc Picard, where, I'm in love with my best friend's wife, so I have to put that aside for my best friend and just be friends with his wife. I think there's also kind of a partnership forming here where she's the only person that can tell him what to do, really, as the CMO of the USS Enterprise in terms of his actual fitness to serve. And I think the show has gone out of its way to really stress that.
That's a very good point, because that's a counterpoint sort of to Troy, who Picard respects as the counselor, as an advisor, but he'll but Troy's not in a position to necessarily tell him what to do. If she feels that Jean-Luc has something psychologically untoward, I think you'll find that she goes to Dr. Crusher
Yes.
because she realizes that the only other officer who really has, under regular circumstances, the ability to say, Jean-Luc, you have to come to sick bay,
Yeah.
is her. Now, there will be situations where Picard, is like in the last one, in uh, the Lonely Only, whatever it was
Oh,
called,
The Lonely Among Us.
The Lonely Among Us, where he was, kind of overtaken by that entity from the cloud. Then there was a discussion between Troy and Riker and Crusher as to whether something was wrong with the captain and whether they should kind of remove his command authority, which I think Starfleet regulations outlines. Situations like that are always going to be tough because you need to follow some rules and guidelines so that you don't just declare a mutiny.
Well, I think it's also, and I always kind of want to get back to like our first episode where we discussed a lot of things about Encounter at Farpoint and how that show is really thematic of the entire series in general. One thing that I thought that you were really great for pointing out was, you know, originally the first Enterprise under James T. Kirk only had 587 people at most, but it was not only an exploratory vessel, it was also a battleship.
Mhm.
Um, and all of those were officers.
Mhm.
There was not like a civilian among them. Or maybe there were a few civilians like diplomatic attaches and stuff like that, people that would serve in an official capacity.
Right.
But, as we discussed in the last episode, Justice, the Enterprise D is a city
Mhm.
in many ways. So the responsibility of the captain in this case is so overwhelming compared to previous captains, and in some ways every captain afterwards, because Ben Sisko, with DS9 and Defiant, he only has to be in charge of the Starfleet aspects of DS9, because there's the Bajoran Authority under Odo that takes care of the security.
Mhm.
Janeway only has to take care of Voyager, and Voyager is nothing but officers and the integrated Maquis. Archer, all of those are officers. There's no civilians among the Enterprise NX-01's crew. Even Discovery, there are no civilians.
Mhm.
I think that we need to note with the show now, since we're talking about it, like the Enterprise D is very unique in the fact that it has over 1,000 people on it, not just the crew. The crew, I looked it up, only made up like 300 people.
Really?
But yeah, but that means there's 700 plus people, women, children, husbands, wives, sons, daughters, entire families, just on this ship. So we're in a very unique environment where the responsibility of a captain, like I said, is just overwhelming. And Beverly plays both a good foil, but also like as a storyteller, I like that she provides with this ability to say like the captain needs to stand down or the captain needs to come to sick bay. She can always be there to up the tension of an episode, which I
Mhm.
think is very important. And I think
Mhm.
was actually the thing that really made The Lonely Among Us work.
Mhm.
Um, but kind of, getting back to the show. Um, so the Enterprise is meeting a Ferengi starship. I'm trying to remember the actual ship's name if there was one. No, I don't think they ever talked.
I don't remember them saying the name of the Ferengi vessel. No.
So, but it's under the command of a Damon Bach,
Mhm.
who says that uh, they came under under control of a Federation starship they found drifting in space, an unidentified constellation class, and that they're bringing it to as a gift to the hero of Maxia, which is Captain Picard. Picard realizes they are referring to an incident that took place 9 years prior when he commanded the USS Stargazer. While traveling through the Maxia Zeta system, the Stargazer was attacked by an unknown vessel, which Picard was forced to destroy. It turns out the vessel was Ferengi. Unfortunately, the Stargazer was badly damaged by an internal fire during the battle, and they had to actually evacuate and ditch the Stargazer in space. And there's actually a few Picard novels that were written, a good bit ago,
Hmm.
but they talk about the period after the Stargazer between his abandoning the Stargazer, him going through like a court-martial proceeding because the Battle of Maxia was not an easy topic of conversation for Starfleet because it was first contact with an alien species, and
Well,
then
an important point,
yeah, go
just to
ahead.
jump in real quick, is that it was the Ferengi that referred to the events at Maxia in that system as the Battle of
Oh
uh,
well, I actually wanted to get in.
Starfleet, at least Picard didn't label it as a battle, so to speak. It seems
No, it was like an incident to him, or just like a
right,
skirmish that never had any explanation, but it's the reason why he lost
exactly,
his ship.
exactly.
One thing. So I went to school for history and religion, and one thing that I think we never really take for, or we kind of take for granted, is again our kind of communal unified myths that we tell each other, the legends that we hold true in our communities, and we discussed this on
Yes,
some previous episodes. But I think one thing that we never take into account is that even though we are in a globalized system here in the modern day, there are still communities that have their own stories and their own tales and their own myths and their own beliefs and their own perceptions of things that would surprise and shock us in a way. For example, um, the the dictatorship of North Korea has a very distorted view of global history in terms of the Korean War, which they paint as this kind of glorious defense of the North Korean peninsula, or the Korean peninsula, where they victoriously defended their homeland from these American demons. And since then, they've been effortlessly holding us off through the miraculous power of the Kim regime. Now, all of this is, of course, a lie in terms of the actual history going around. We know that North Korea is a impoverished, beggared country full of concentration and prison camps of political dissidents that are punished simply for disagreeing with the notion that Kim is God. But it's important to make a note of this because some communities, when they're closed off, which the Ferengi are when we meet them in this episode, they are still closed off to the Federation. They have their own myths, they have their own ideas, they already have their own history in their mind about what the Federation is. And to them, the Stargazer incident, which is just a small incident to Picard and the Federation, may actually be this huge incident in Ferengi history where these are where we first met this is where we first met the humans, and
yes,
this is why we don't trust them because they destroyed our ship.
right.
So I've always found that the clash of cultures is not just the things we believe, but it's also the cultural narratives we tell.
Hmm.
And there's a huge part of global history that kind of gets left out that I wish we paid much more attention to in terms of the actual stories we tell leading up to events. Because even like,
Yes,
World War II is such a gigantic moment in the original Star Trek series, and it remains, kind of a big deal in certain aspects of Next Generation. The Nazis had their own mythology and their own perception and their own history of the world that they doctored, that they were planning to propagate through propaganda if they, were ultimately victorious. So did the communist regime in Russia. And
what's
in many ways, so did we.
what's the saying that the history is written by the victors?
Exactly.
It's interesting what you say about the Korean War
but
because
the thing is, it's not just written by the victors. If there are people that survive, there's also the history written by the survivors.
that's what I wanted to say is that I think when if you talk to people about the Korean War, they emphasize on the conflict with North Korea when it was actually a major conflict with communist China.
Right.
And one of the um, um, opportunities I had on a trip to Beijing, I rode the Beijing subway all by myself and went to the Chinese Military Museum
Right.
and walked in. I'm sure I was being carefully watched as what this foreign devil is doing in here all by himself, and walked through the whole section on the Korean War. And of course, I did not was not none of the museum was not in English at all. It was all in Mandarin, but I could tell by the pictures that this was the Chinese version. That this was a great victory
Mm-hmm.
of the Chinese, the Red Army supporting their communist North Korean brothers against the imperialist Americans.
Right. And the thing is, history is so skewed in terms of the action. The truth is not here or there, because the nation of South Korea by itself is kind of a repudiation of China's narrative, which is,
Mm-hmm.
in many ways why they have kind of a fraught relationship not only with South Korea but also with Japan too.
Mm-hmm.
Japan
Mm-hmm.
also in many ways offers many narratives that counter China's. Um,
Yes.
so, you know, the Ferengi finally bring forth the Stargazer, and I have to tell you, I've always loved this ship, the Stargazer. It kind of looks battered and dirty to me
Mm-hmm.
from the outside, but
Mm-hmm.
the Ferengi at one point make, I think it's Kazago when he's talking to Riker, he makes a point and says, we've returned you your warship. And it made me wonder about the class of vessels that were distributed among the fleet, um, in the Federation. Because if this thing doesn't necessarily look like an exploratory or scientific vessel, it does kind of look like a battered battleship
It
in a
does,
way.
yes.
And it makes you wonder, like, what kind of, and talking about how this episode gets into Picard's history, it does in some ways make you wonder what kind of career Jean-Luc Picard had before this episode, before he was in charge of taking care of 700 plus people on top of his crew, in this massive city of a ship. What was he doing on this kind of dingy battle scarred vessel?
Well, that's a good point because, we know from, other future seasons and episodes of Star Trek Next Generation that as a Starfleet midshipman, he was very brash.
Mm-hmm.
He was very arrogant and proud. And, if that's how he was when he was young, there's, to see him, how he behaves and how he acts and how he projects his leadership, he has matured a lot. So you
Mm-hmm.
bring up a good point because if that was his first command, that would be a challenge in itself. So, what did the captain of the Stargazer and what he went through with losing the ship? How did that change him? How did that mature him?
Well, I think there's an interesting part of life when we go back and deal with things from our past. Like, for example, you still live in my hometown of Apex, North Carolina. And in some ways, Picard going back to the Stargazer is like going home for him.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you, I live up here in New York and we're recording this, but I can tell you every time I go back to Apex now, and it's been a while since, of course, the pandemic set in. But every time I've come back, there's always this kind of weird sense of this is part of who I was, and this is part of where I grew up, and this is part of what made me, but it's not necessarily who I am anymore.
Oh,
And
I
I
can.
think this,
Oh, yeah.
and I think you can see that because the town itself has changed. Like there's more people there,
No, I
there's more
can.
businesses, it's
Oh,
developed, there's more houses. The things that were used to be familiar, even my own high school's been torn down and rebuilt with a new
rebuilt. It's
one.
totally new. You've
So,
never even physically seen the new one.
well,
I mean,
all
I
the
had a similar experience.
yeah, go
I, I,
ahead.
I know what you mean because, your mother and I were married in September of 83,
Hmm.
and we moved to Southern California to Los Angeles for a year. And we were there for 13 months. And we moved back to Baltimore, where was born, had spent all my life. After I got back, Baltimore was never the same.
Hmm.
Before I left, Baltimore was the center of the universe.
Yeah.
And being in Los Angeles and Southern California for a year, and traveling out to San Bernardino and going to San Diego on a regular basis, and driving to San Francisco for meetings and things of that sort, having that whole experience in California so much expanded my vision of the
Hmm.
world, that when we moved back to Baltimore, Baltimore just wasn't the same. It was more like a small city.
And one thing that I think is really, I think it's interesting you bring up the idea of it being a small city because one contrast I think the show does very well to make is the differences between the bridge of the Enterprise and the bridge of the Stargazer.
Mm-hmm.
Because the bridge of the Enterprise, when Picard's on it, it's this kind of massive, expansive chamber that has these
Mm-hmm.
huge chairs that everyone sits in and these large stations. Where the bridge of the Stargazer is much smaller, the chairs are much smaller, the proportions of it are much more cramped. I think in some ways there is, like you said, there's this kind of going back to it and realizing that you may have outgrown something or your perception of the place beforehand, now that you've had these experiences outside of that place that you were for such a long time. Going back, I think what you're talking about is something Picard experiences in that very moment when he's looking around the bridge
Mm-hmm.
the first
Right.
time when he beams aboard. And
Right.
I think that's a very human thing that really helps us connect with the character.
Yes.
I'm sorry, did I interrupt you? Did you have
No, 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 I didn't. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um so one thing that uh kind of bothers me about the show and you included in your notes is that the beginning of the show is that the beginning of the show opens with the Enterprise on standby with the Ferengi vessel for 3 days. Um, and it takes a while for not a while, but it takes a bit for Beverly and Picard and Beverly to suspect what's going on. But Troy immediately identifies deception
Yes.
when they finally talk to Damon Bach, and right before they beam him on board, and they decide, based on her analysis, that he's clearly being deceptive, that they're going to beam him on board for this meeting. But I just kind of find it odd that they kind of followed this ship for 3 days. And it just seems like a very kind of weird thing that Starfleet would okay.
My reaction to that is I think that I mean, from a practical basis, it's like, since humans still did not know or understand the Ferengi well, and the Ferengi had invited the Enterprise to come and meet them, I think that it was sort of like a diplomatic thing that Picard said, okay, we'll hang out till we hear from them. At the same time, on a completely kind of unpractical basis, just related to the story, it's something I think the writers did to just set up the whole story. And
Oh yeah, of
it
course.
set up the whole thing of there's something deceptive going on here that, yeah.
No, of course. I just note that with Star Trek, sometimes the framing of these stories
Exactly.
has a little bit of has just this little note of like a logic. Um, poor logic to it that you just kind of note, like, what are these people doing here like this?
So what you're saying, if they had a Vulcan on board, they say, why are we staying here for 3 days? It's not making any sense.
Well, think about this. If you had a government that you didn't communicate regularly with, call out and say that we need to talk to the specific captain on your flagship vessel because we have something that we want to return to him. And then you send him out because it's like, we haven't talked to these people before. This is essentially not first contact, but second or third contact, which is just as important. And you send them out there, and then they don't talk to you for 3 days. If I'm at Starfleet Command, I'm like, what the fuck is going on here? Come home.
It's definitely a wee bit strange, yes.
But anyway, so one thing that's going on while they're waiting for the Ferengi to actually talk to them and actually for Damon Bach to introduce the Stargazer element to the storyline, Picard is suddenly beset with these headaches. And there's this interesting dialogue that he has with Beverly where he tells her, I have this headache, and she expresses this real surprise. And he's like, headache, don't you know what a headache is? And she's like, yes, but I've rarely seen them, because it turns out later on in the episode, as they elaborate, they have finally been able to map the brain. And they have understanding of things like the common cold, headaches, and migraines, and have essentially in their century cured these things.
Oh, and the key thing is that they seem to totally understand the mechanism of pain.
Yeah. Well, like, I think that's a fascinating point to talk on because, we are currently in the midst of a very, before we had the pandemic, we were in the midst of an opioid epidemic here in this country that really had to do with how we manage pain on a medical
We
level.
still are in the midst of the opioid epidemic also. Yeah.
Well, of course we are. I don't mean to diminish that in any way.
Sure.
But I think it's kind of fascinating that in the future there is this assumption that we have been able to at least scientifically achieve the hurdle of understanding, at least physical suffering in a way. And I think that is such a huge thing that kind of gets missed in all this in terms of determining what kind of universe Star Trek is really kind of in, and what does it say about the humans? Of course, going back to the first episode, Q has labeled us barbaric and unworthy of space travel, unworthy of going out into the universe. But here we are, essentially not, maybe not curing pain, but we now have an understanding of pain to the level that we're able to cure and fix maladies that, today we live with. They're just common.
Well, you
And I
bring
think
up
that's just a huge advancement that we,
and things like that are happening now. For instance, one of the things I do is I work with a company that's trying to develop a drug to treat a certain retinal disease, and the chief scientific officer, who is a histopathologist and has studied a particular type of retinal disease related to age-related macular degeneration, using very fresh human donor eyes from patients who have that disease, comparing them to normal eyes. She's also gotten very involved with some companies that are developing and enhancing something called optical coherence tomography, or OCT, where you can use light waves to look at a cross section of the retina. And like every couple months, the resolution, I mean, you're talking about 5 nanometers resolution, 5 microns, and the light waves, the return and so forth goes through some sort of computer interpretation. And the ability to use this non-invasive procedure to understand retinal disease and then help develop new therapies for it is truly amazing. And
Oh,
I had a conversation with this scientist the other day, and she was talking about how the advances in retinal OCT are just constantly improving. I said, "This is real Star Trek," and she said, "Yeah, it is."
well,
And I think the same thing is happening
sorry.
with imaging related to the brain, understanding brain function, brain pathways. And just as a quick aside, there's really some progress being made in gene therapy now, also.
Oh, absolutely. Um, some of the, honestly, gene therapy offers such potential in terms of really dealing with a whole host of, not only viruses and diseases, um, and that we come across in the world, but so many genetic disorders and maladies, and so many genetic diseases that are passed along through through gene pools.
Well, one just real
It
quick, one quick example and related to this disease, there's a wet form of it, and
mhm.
you use something called a anti vascular endothelial growth factor drug,
You're
and
talking
that's
about wet AMD.
wet
Just
AMD. And the way that's generally treated when somebody progresses at that point, they inject these anti-VEGF drugs into the eye. Well, one company's developed a way that you can put a gene or genetic material into the eye
mhm,
that will incorporate into the retinal cells, and they will actually make the anti-VEGF agent.
mhm.
So instead of having to do the injection, they're working toward that you can, insert, create the ability within the retina, the disease retina itself, to produce the drug.
I was reading somewhere, I think it's in England, they had just recently broken the genetic code on a lizard's ability to regenerate its own limbs.
Yeah, they've been done. Yeah, there's been a lot of work on that. Yeah,
But
exactly.
but apparently they finally broke it, and there's like they finally think that there may be human application in terms of being able to maybe genetically, engineer humans to regrow their limbs.
It's all a matter of figuring out how to turn the genes off in the right sequence at the right time.
Well, it gets back to this idea of like curing the headache and the common cold and migraines.
Right.
A future where you don't have, Star Trek really does kind of push this idea that this is a post scarcity future where there's no disease, there's no poverty, there's no homelessness, there's no wars. You've essentially taken out all the four horsemen of the apocalypse except death. Death is kind of an inevitable thing.
Well, when we you brought this up, the other thing I thought about is in, I guess it's the Star Trek movie, The Voyage Home, when they're bringing,
Oh yeah,
the
the
Klingon,
whales.
the whales, that they go to get Chekhov out of the hospital, and McCoy's walking through and
Oh
just
yeah.
sees this old lady on a gurney. She says, "What are you here for?" He said, "Kidney dialysis." And he says, "Oh my God, 20th century medicine." He said, "Here, swallow this pill." And then as they're escaping the hospital, she's going, "I grew a new kidney. I grew a new kidney."
Yeah. Well, I remember growing up the just the not not ignorant, but the very difficult debate around stem cells because it was so tied to the abortion conversation. Because growing up, a lot of the idea, the big public belief is that all stem cells were being taken from fetuses, and that these were all
Right.
fetal stem cells, and that
They
was not the
they
case.
aren't. That isn't the case. Correct.
Um, but now, if you look at the application of stem cells in terms of therapy, especially from like sports injuries, it's become such a commonplace now that I think that we are on the border, we are on the cusp of. It gets into a question of like Star Trek and evolution, maybe the evolution of our own species. how would we change in a future where we have wiped out or we've been able to mitigate most diseases and viruses that come our way? Most of our physical frailties and ailments have been taken care of or can be addressed. Um, like what will that do to us as a species by the time the 24th century rolls around?
Well, it brings up the question of, longevity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's interesting that just in the last day or two, the, I guess, Health and Human Services, measures longevity, life expectancy in the U.S. And because of COVID-19, and I'm sure there are other medical factors and social factors, the uh,
Oh, right.
longevity of Americans has dropped by a year.
Well, it was going down beforehand because of the opioid crisis, but
And
also there's there's a real massive homelessness problem in major American
it
cities.
it gets into the economics, it gets into racial disparity, and you know uh, unequal access to medical care. Even
Can I ask you a weird, quick dovetail question since we're talking about this?
sure,
You talked about how you moved out to LA. Um, and what year was that again? 83?
we were there from October '83 through November of '84.
What was the homeless situation like out in LA then? Because from
It
what I
was
understand now, it's just crazy.
I haven't been I it was not very visible
Okay.
back then. It
Because
existed, but it was not very visible. You did not have, you know, homeless camps, as I understand it, with hundreds of people under freeways as it is now.
well, it's not hundreds of people in LA. Apparently now it's thousands upon thousands
I
of people.
I stand corrected. Yes.
And
Yeah.
I live. Margot and I moved out to. Margot was Ben's mom. Everyone, she's been mentioned before. But Margot and I lived out in Denver for about 7 months, Denver, Colorado, and the homeless situation out there was pretty startling too. Um, I know in Charlotte now that they have a tent city that's along North. I think it's along North Davidson,
Mm.
and it's starting to get up into the hundreds. So I think the lowering of the life expectancy here in the U.S. is not surprising in terms of the systemic problems that we've been dealing in terms of
Correct.
poverty
Correct. Yes.
and our obvious health challenges. Um, I think the nice part is that Star Trek at least provides the possibility of a future where we've dealt with these things. And I
Hmm.
think we are dealing with these things. One thing that I don't think that we're heralding enough in terms of dealing with this pandemic is the progress we made in terms of these mRNA viruses.
Oh, you mean the mRNA
I'm
vaccines?
I'm sorry, these mRNA vaccines.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a big step.
it really is a huge step, and if we can tackle this, there's a possibility that we can tackle other viruses and pandemics that possibly co- come down along the path of history and
Yeah, I think
really
I may have
change our
sent
destiny.
may have sent you that short video about the from the CDC on the
Yes.
mRNA viruses, and it really explained well how what they are, how they work. And the only question now is because of Operation Warp Speed and the need to develop a virus to SARS-CoV-2 so quickly, is we don't have long-term safety studies. We don't know, whether
Yeah.
a year, 2 years out, whether there'll be any ad, ad adverse effects.
Well, I was
It's
just
it's
watching. Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just watching an interview with Fauci,
Uh-huh.
and they were asking questions about like when children are going to get vaccinated. In the original trials, they were vaccinating as young as 16, and then I think they expanded the trials as young as 12.
Mm.
But I think he said that they were going to look at young as 7 for getting starting to get children vaccinated. But
Yeah.
at the same time, like it may not, it's not going to be like a vaccine that you get once in your life. It's probably going to be a yearly vaccine as it is. even
Possibly.
though, we now have the extra challenge of the South African variant apparently diminishing the effectiveness of some of these vaccines. I don't know
Hmm.
if I'm not sure which vaccines in particular that they diminished, if it was all of them, but I know that it apparently the South African variant has very adverse effects on the AstraZeneca um,
Right. Right. Exactly.
variant. But we're getting off into inside
Sure.
baseball.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
so when they meet the Ferengi, it's Damon Bach and his first officer Kazago. And there's one note that you sent along before we got to this episode where we talked about clothed females, and it kind of gets back to the Ferengi and the previous episode. What is it called? The Last Outpost,
Yes.
where they kind of have this thing where like they talked about the greatest temptation is that that the humans have created the greatest temptation by clothing their females, and now like the temptation is to take off all the clothes. And you mentioned in the last episode that we taped Justice that Roddenberry has this very weird kind of interesting predilection for sex, and that sex kind of shows up in these very weird ways.
Yes.
And this is still under Roddenberry's regime, in terms of the production of the show. I I think that there is. I don't think that the Ferengi are built enough to show any. We haven't seen any female Ferengi, and we won't see any
No.
female Ferengi until Deep Space Nine, where they actually start like building out why these Ferengi are so misogynistic and how their society is actually set up. Um, but I think the entire idea of being these kind of spacefaring capitalists or Yankee traders, as Riker first called them,
Yes.
or Data first called them,
Yes.
um, I think there is an interesting kind of measure of it. I think that there's an interesting viewpoint from the Ferengis where they measure everything by whether it can be bought or sold, traded or profited from.
Hmm.
And in some ways, in this episode, we're going to see how that plays out on somewhat of a moral level. Because in many ways, and this gets to a point that I kind of want you to expand on, the question of revenge, and that revenge there never is a profit. Uh, Weirdly, I think both the Federation and the Ferengi philosophically, even though they come from two very different places, where the Ferengi believe there is a constant scarcity that is actually fed by the great they have an official name for it, like the great profit continuum.
Hmm.
It's what the rules of acquisition work off of.
Right.
Basically, the idea is
Right.
that like somewhere, some way, something needs to be traded so that the
Yes.
universe works.
Yes.
Um, but I think when Kazago and Riker finally realize that Damon Bach is using the Stargazer and giving it away for free, which Kazago is the first one to say, like, this is bad juju, or this is bad business.
This is not following. This is in contravention of the rules of acquisition.
Exactly. There's no
Basically,
profit from this.
there's no profit from this.
Um, I think I think humans and Ferengis would come together under the idea that if something is born of hatred and there's no actual result from it, it's not worth it. And it's kind of a weird place where capitalism may have its own morality. And I'll just leave it there for you to go off of. If you want to follow up
Yeah.
on that, or if you want to get into the
No. Well, that was
aspect of revenge.
the aspect of revenge, and I'm talking about the capitalism too. Is that was the only heavy philosophical issue or topic that came up for me in this episode. And you hit the nail on the head toward the end. The comment is made, in revenge, there is never a profit. And I think that someone also says, what is past is past. And I thought about
Oh
that.
yeah, because August says that.
Yeah. And I've thought about that the last several days in terms of events that have happened to me where I feel like I was treated unfairly. And in some cases, I've had feelings of the need to revenge against somebody for treating me that way and so forth.
Oh yeah.
And as time goes on, I've realized that, that negative emotion, that hatred, really doesn't get you anything. And I think the wisdom that comes from that comes from the statement, what's past is past. And there really is no profit in revenge. You read comments all the time that, failure is part of life, failure is part of growth.
Mhm.
And what people need to do, individuals need to do, is carry on and learn from those failures so that they can, address a opportunity in a different way in the future, learn from it and so on. And I can't think of any, specific situations like that are easy to describe, where things that I've learned from the past, well, I know what they are, but again, it would take too long to describe them and so forth, put it together into a cogent whole. But I can see where things that happened in the past that were negative, that weren't good, that caused feelings of revenge, that once I got past that, which it takes time to do, there were things that I learned that I can apply to situations in the future, and which
So,
will help me increase the chances of having a positive outcome, not just for myself, but for the other parties.
yeah. So it's interesting that we're talking about this because
And just to go on, and then, that gets into the whole, your comment about capitalism and, comparing it to the Yankee trader, piratical, privateer type of capitalism that the Ferengi, you know, we touched on this before, is that when the wall came down in Berlin and the Soviet Union collapsed, and that one Asian American historian said, well, that's the end of history. And that was wrong. And he didn't really mean that. And there were some people need to look historically and understand, why did a communist state form out of Marxism, Leninism? It was a reaction to the injustices of the feudal system and serfdom in Eastern Europe and so
why did it
forth.
form out of Tsardom?
Yeah. So, so there was some potentially some positive things that were meant to come out of Leninism, Marxism, and that sort of social and economic system. That could be a whole long, discourse on why it didn't work. And I think that it was seen as, well, that's just shows you that capitalism is the best thing.
Well,
And that was in '89. And of course, we talked before about, 80s were the time of Ronald Reagan and Gordon Gekko, greed is good.
mm-hmm.
And, if you go back to those who, particularly believe in Jesus just as a philosopher, don't get into whether he's a deity or not, greed is not good.
Ultimately, no.
Ultimately not. You have to, and I think if you go to extreme capitalism, so that it's win-lose rather than, win, you might have a big win, the other party might have a smaller win, but there has to be some mutual benefit. I see it all as, how do you define the social contract that keeps society functional? And part of the things we're talking now about, income inequality, unequal access to health care. Some of that is related to, some capitalist attitudes like, hey, you go out and win, and some people win and some people lose. And we're at a point in human society where if you take that attitude, it's going to cause more problems. And it is
Well,
causing more problems even for those that are sort of at the top of the food chain.
well, I think the so a couple
But I'll
things.
say at the top of the economic food chain.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that's where I was going. So I'll say a couple things. Um, I think on one hand, there to address the point of like why communism, socialism failed in Russia after the outbreak of after its defeat of the czarist regime. Um, I think one reason that people don't, I think people, the reason why the Leninists and the Bolsheviks were able to take on socialism and communism so easily because under feudalism there is a market system. I don't think people understand that. It's not just this simple idea of like the Lord gets all the wealth and then he distributes it. There's always been a market system, and there was a market system during the medieval times. There was a market system during the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, leading up. So we've always had market
They,
systems.
they those producers in those older systems had to have enough resources to survive. Otherwise, the system would quickly fail.
But you actually need trade to actually keep alliances and relationships going. It Believe it or not, it can't just work off word alone. Word alone doesn't feed your families. Word alone doesn't keep your armies armed and stationed and armored. Like you actually need commerce. And in some ways, capitalism has served a very great good by democratizing commerce. Originally, that's the idea behind capitalism. It's going to democratize commerce and take away power from the feudal lords and give it into the middle class. This is why the French Revolution was really such a big deal because it was a revolution of an economic middle class. It wasn't just a revolution of the peasants, even though the peasants played a huge part in it. Um, I say all this because, the reason why communism failed is because it didn't actually allow any freedom of competition within it. And even
Mhm.
within the Federation, there is a sense of competition in terms of like, how can I be a better person? In some ways, you're competing with yourself. In Russia, the communists beat the shit out of you in terms of the idea that you could actually better yourself as a person. You were simply born as you were, you served the function that you served, or you were assigned within the communist system. And ultimately, you either died being a good communist or you died in a camp as a bad communist. And then that's what your kids are going to do. If you were a cobbler in after the Bolshevik Revolution, your kid's going to be a cobbler after you're dead. Like, you know, capitalism in some ways has allowed an exploration and freedom of the human spirit that socialism and communism simply can't do on its own. But
You said you mean exploitation,
no exploration, exploration. Not
exploration.
no exploration. Like people are going to be shocked, but I'm actually making a pro capitalism argument here.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm going
Yeah.
to make the anti-capitalism argument right afterwards too. Um, but capitalism, and you can speak to this as an entrepreneur. Only through entrepreneurship would some of the ideas that you've brought into the world be able to come to fruition. They wouldn't necessarily come together under government supervision or um, motivation. They wouldn't necessarily come together under private business. It takes a unique individual sometimes with an entrepreneurial spirit to go out there and create something unique in the world or a service that really provides something that no one's ever seen or no one knows that they want it and really improves things on a societal level. I think capitalism does encourage this better than not.
I would agree. Yes.
The problem, and this is where we're going to get into it, is that no one, and this is my big criticism of everyone listening to this podcast in the modern world, and it's my criticism of me, it's my criticism of Jake, and Ben, it might be my criticism of you one day. We are not taking into account scale. And it's not just the scale of our victories, the good things capitalism does, but it's not taking into account the scale of the bad things that capitalism produces. And the truth is that the good things capitalism produces are not scaled equally to the bad things capitalism produces now. Capitalism has now in the modern era, and this is somewhat what Marx said would happen in terms of late stage capitalism. The negatives that we get out of capitalism in terms of the whole benefit to the human race are more negative than the goods we're getting out of it. And it's a question of scale. The bads have been scaled up. The goods have not been scaled up with them. It gets into the question of income inequality. You know, in Star Trek, there's this post-scarcity world where they don't have to worry about income, but here we have to worry about income inequality in our real world. And what's happened was the cost of goods kept rising since the 70s, but wages haven't risen. But the growth and profits of companies have risen exponentially since Reagan in the 80s. And even with the dot-com bust and Enron in 2008 and all of these things that happened that, you know, really affected people like you and me and people, at one point we were upper middle class, and I would say that we're clearly middle class now, but let me finish.
Yeah, go ahead.
Going all the way down to the poorest of the poor, capitalism's negatives affects us now in such ways that, like, the only people that really feel the benefit are the ones, like you noted beforehand, are the ones at the top. And even they like you noted before, are stuttering the note that the negatives of capitalism are starting to reach them. It's a question of scale. We don't appreciate the scale of the negatives.
Well, part of what you're saying is, you're looking at a system. You have to keep a system. There has to be a balance in a system.
Absolutely.
Feedback. And so, what you're saying, as I see it, is that we've lost the balance. And one of the things that, this came up as a Jeopardy question
Well, it's
the
a
other
social
night.
contract. The social
It is
contract
a social contract.
enabled
And
that balance.
I think one of the worst things that was done by the Supreme Court, and I don't understand, I won't look at the constitutional aspects of it and so forth, but just from a practical basis, Citizens United was the biggest fuck up that they ever did.
Well,
in my opinion, in terms of what that's done to politics and further putting things out of balance.
Well, it's reverse communism. So here's the thing: you have all these capitalists, you have all these Ferengi, and it's funny that we're talking about the Ferengi. You have all these Ferengi because, a lot of these people think that they're space Jews. They're not space Jews, and anyone who thinks that is being an anti-Semite. They're space capitalists. So let's be mean to capitalists here and now. Like, what the Ferengi represent is this sense of avarice and ownership that I think is so prevalent in the West that when we finally do see it in Star Trek, it's being put up against what Roddenberry hopes is our modern future, and kind of casting the people in 1987 watching this, kind of putting up a mirror and being like, look at these wretched little goblins you've turned yourselves into for the pursuit of money and wealth and power. And, even to the point that you'll pursue revenge and throw all that away.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that capitalism and feudalism both share is an enjoyment of excess. In terms of capital gets allocated in both feudalism and capitalism. And this is a defect of capitalism, but it was a benefit of feudalism. Like, we have to remember, like, these systems work differently. it was a benefit in feudalism if you were the king that capital accrued around you, that the capital of the state accrued around you because you were the sovereign. In capitalism, if you have this unequal distribution of income, you are going to have a societal breakdown where you need to have a social contract where the people on top say, we're going to make sure that the people at the very bottom at least have some sense of dignity, to the point where they're not driven to such desperation that they go insane to where they either set into such a societal decay they never pull themselves out of it, and worse, drag more people into it. And this is, I have to say, for people at home listening to this, and you, Dad, this has always been my argument ultimately against the conservative economic vision. Um, you know,
Well, it's an
Poverty
interesting,
produces two things: it produces desperation, or it produces violence.
and part of what's happened politically in the U.S. leading up to January 6th fits very well into what you just said.
Yeah. Well, like a lot of
And,
those.
and a lot of those people see themselves as conservatives,
So,
but
NPR just posted all of them.
what they really need to be is that they're actually, in a sense, victims of conservatism.
Oh, and they're victims of capitalism too.
There are victims of capitalism also.
Well,
Yes.
like, you know, NPR just posted an article where they posted all of their names and all their profiles and all the charges against all of the, I think right now it's up to 202 people.
Hmm.
Um, One thing that keeps being struck is that a lot of these people are like middle class to upper middle class white people. And I think one thing that we kind of forgot about the economy before COVID is that we were in a really desperate situation to begin with, where, this is this Forbes article, and I'll link it in the description for everyone below when this episode debuts. But, you know, at least 70% of the nation was living paycheck to paycheck.
Hmm.
That fact alone is devastating.
It is.
50% of people making $100,000 or more could not save month to month. So
Right.
like you could make a significant amount of money per month, but all of your expenses basically wipe that out. A lot of people making $150,000 or more, like 70% of them were in debt, like $15,000 or more. A lot, you have so many people who are working you have so many people working minimum wage jobs who are already in severe debt and not being able to make their bills, and then this pandemic hits. you know we had a problem going into this that no one was addressing, and no one addresses it honestly in the media. No one really addresses it honestly in our political system or in our leadership, and I even put that on certain people like AOC. Like, we don't really address how bad the economic devastation has become since Reagan on a person to person level.
Hmm.
Like, we don't see what life looks like for someone making $100,000 a year versus what someone making 75 versus someone making 34. Which, by the way, if you're making $34,000 a year, which being here in New York is dog shit, like you literally couldn't live in New York on
Hmm.
$34,000 a year. And I work in the industry where that's the starting pay here in Manhattan. If you want to work in Manhattan as an associate editor at a big five publisher, you have to move to the most expensive city on earth under the expectation that you're going to be making $35,000 a year with no health benefits whatsoever. Just think about that. That's what capitalism has enabled. That's not a sustainable thing. But
Hmm.
feudalism wasn't sustainable either.
Right.
So we've gone on this big long tangent about this because, one thing that the Ferengi kind of alerts about Damon Bach is that he's doing something very strange when he gives over the Stargazer. Um, God, I can't remember. Kazago goes, ugly, very ugly.
Exactly. Yes. Right.
And I think there's one thing that, again, I know I'm making a very weird pro capitalism than making an anti-capitalism argument, because I ultimately I think capitalism where it is now is more anti-capitalism in my
Well,
viewpoint.
what I hear you saying is that it's just so many things are just out of balance.
Well, it's not just out of balance. Like, we say out of balance, and that is a very simplistic idea of, like,
It is.
there's more people. The idea is that more people have more and less people have less.
I'm
And
just talking.
the
Right.
problem that I'm trying to highlight here is that it's not just that less people have more and more people have less, but when something happens to cause more people to have less, it's far devastating,
Oh, I
far more
agree that
devastating,
when
and
I
the
say
returns are just getting less and less and less, and the losses of capitalism are getting exponentially worse in terms of
well,
their
you
effect.
know, I agree. When I say things are out of balance, that's a simplistic way of saying it. And what needs to be further said,
And I don't
uh,
think you're
it,
simplistic in saying that,
no,
by the
no,
way.
no. I think it. No, I agree. It is simplest to just say it's out of balance because it's actually much more than that. And you brought that up during this conversation. Is that it's political leaders and social leaders, and even the public at large. People need to understand what the hell is going on.
Oh yeah.
Why we need to come to a common understanding as to why things are out of balance and what needs to change, what needs to be fixed. And that's starting to be discussed. And, and for instance, we said something in the beginning about, before the podcast started about looks like the American Rescue Package, whatever Biden administration is calling is going to go through. And, this is a bigger economic shot in the arm than what Obama did after the 2008 financial crisis, and we're saying it's really important. But once that's done, I think what we're kind of getting to is it's not just giving that shot in the arm to families and individuals and so forth, but how is the policy and practice going to change in the near future?
Well, okay. So you brought up the revered Barry, and I love Barack Obama. I voted for Barack Obama twice, but we have to be honest about the 2008 recovery package, the TARP.
Mhm.
Um, that was a bailout of the rich and
It
wealthy
was,
and the
yeah,
financial structure. It wasn't a
yes,
bailout of the actual American people.
no,
The reason was they weren't actually facing a crisis like COVID. COVID has legitimately changed everything,
hmm
where you not only need a shot in the arm for the general American person on the ground,
hmm
like, there really does need to be structural changes here, because
right,
2000, if COVID, and what I've when I'm not as working as a fantasy author, and when I'm not doing this podcast with you, and when I'm not raising you, Ben, I sometimes work with economists doing research and helping them write papers. And one thing that was being talked about early on before COVID was we were going to have another market bust, a la 2008, but it was going to be worse because we didn't learn any of the lessons of 2008, and we really didn't follow through on Dodd-Frank, and consumer protections are kind of a joke. And these are all things that deserve their own podcasts on their own. But, you know, we just knew that after 2020, or after 2020, there was going to be a market bust. In some ways, COVID's been a good thing because it withheld that. Like, it depressed the market anyway.
hmm
So, like, you didn't have to have a bust because the market was the market was pushed down. Um, that's not necessarily a good thing, but it's good because, like, crashes are very, very bad, and we're not. Despite being in the middle of what I think is a depression, at least the depression wasn't brought on about by a crash. We can kind of rise out of this one easier versus the Great Depression, which required multiple social programs, some of which failed. We don't tell the story about that enough, how a lot of these American social programs coming out of Roosevelt actually failed.
hmm
We don't talk about how we dealt arms to the British and the rest of the world to kind of pay off our debts.
Mhm.
And we don't talk about how World War One kind of changed our entire economy. I'm not sorry, World War One, World War Two changed our
Oh
entire
yeah,
economy to where
sure.
the only reason capitalism worked is because we employed socialism during the Second World War, arguably.
Right.
Like, people having their own victory gardens and really, the state taking control of production, because that's what happened during World War II. The
Mhm.
government took control of state production. Car production facilities became bullet facilities and bomb making
People
factories.
didn't build sedans anymore. They built tanks, and they didn't build refrigerators. They built uh, howitzers. Yes.
But the one thing that we don't notice is that the communists did the exact same things. The difference is that we set it up differently to where we had a we allowed entrepreneurs to come in and actually provide ideas to the military and the government through the private sector. And in many ways, and in some
Ag-
ways, it's not been good because for all of the good Henry Ford did America, he also helped the Nazis a lot.
Well, and when you bring that up, probably one of the most successful entrepreneurs and during World War II had good ideas was Higgins
Yeah,
in New Orleans with the landing craft.
yeah. But kind of getting back to the episode, one thing that I think, and I this originally was about how I think the Federation and the Ferengi would agree. There is an excess to things where I think commerce is kind of the great negotiator away from war. And they kind of explored this in DS9 where Quark is this really like, none of you have to fight. We can just sit down and talk about this over a few bars of Latinum and figure it out.
Right.
But really, like, commerce and trade is often a better strategy to war. And what Damon Bach is doing, and Kazago realizes it when he has these interactions with Riker, first officer to first officer,
Hmm.
that like Damon Bach is pursuing something that brings them no profit, will ultimately get the Ferengi Alliance into more trouble with the Federation, and is ultimately, putting him and his own crew at risk. And I think it's just a very interesting thing that a capitalist viewpoint can come to this very kind of moral and even to the point like Kazago doesn't have to warn Riker about anything or tell him that we've taken Damon Bach. He does it out of a sense of honor.
Hmm.
So I think it's just very interesting that this episode kind of points to like on one hand it's always making criticism of capitalism, but in some ways the Ferengi kind of redeem themselves. And this is the first episode where the Ferengi are not necessarily cast ultimately as the bad guys. It's really
Correct.
Damon Bach. And
Yes.
he's really, if you look at it, the first villain that we've had on the show that's a central villain in an episode that's not Q.
Right.
I think everyone else is like, looking back, well, that's not true. Cone of Honor had a God, I can't remember his shitty name. I don't remember want to
Oh,
remember. Luton. Luton.
Luton. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they had Luton as a central villain, but the
Yes.
rest of them have kind of been Q. I'm looking at them now, and yeah, it's really been Q, Luton, and Damon Bach now as central villains. The rest of the shows have kind of been different in terms of creatures or
Hmm.
dealing with the naked now and stuff like that. One thing that I wanted to touch on, and you noted in your notes, is that Wesley's the Wonder Kid. What do you think about that?
Oh, I just think it's interesting where he you know uh, he was tinkering with the what was it, the sensor array and so forth, and he picked up that there was this you know uh, energy that was going on that didn't make any sense. And then, he put that together with, Troy and his mother and Riker that there's something going on psychologically
Oh,
with
right.
Picard, which led to the whole issue of discovering that Damon Bach, because of his vengeance, was, manipulating Picard so that he would go back to the Stargazer and put himself in a position. I think what he was doing is it was almost like a suicide, that Picard was going to imagine that the Enterprise was the Ferengi vessel and attack it, and then because the Enterprise had such superior weapon, he would be killed.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, it goes back to it's just interesting where it seems like in the story it was decided very early on that Wesley was going to be the scientific Mozart. And
Mm-hmm.
it keeps building and building and building until a later season where he decides, he meets the Traveler again, and he goes off with the Traveler and does not go back to Starfleet, doesn't stay on the Enterprise, and
Season 7.
so on. Yeah.
I think on one hand, Wesley is a very easy. There's the term Chekhov's gun in storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
That if you see a gun on a mantle in a story and they pay attention and they make note to have the audience pay attention to the gun on the mantle, at some point the gun is going to come off the mantle and shoot someone.
Mm-hmm.
So it's called Chekhov's gun.
Mm-hmm.
I think in some ways, every time you see Wesley now in an episode, he is going to interact in such a way that he plays a critical part to the story, if not a small one, because he really does play a small role here, even
Yeah.
though it is a critical one. Like, he really
Right.
does have one scene.
Yes.
And he even has that moment where he's like, adults.
Yes, exactly. Right.
But we don't really see him again after that.
No.
I think it's a decent use of him in this episode.
Agree. Yeah.
So one thing. So the first officer relationship. I think they've done a lot in this series so far in the first season to really build kind of the rapport between Picard and Riker.
Yes.
And I think part of it is that Patrick Stewart and Jonathan Frakes really get along well together. But it seems that Riker has fallen into a very good mentor relationship with Picard. And Picard is able to see Riker as a peer that he can trust. And I think that this episode does a really good job of that. It's also the episode where we get to see the Picard Manuver, which
yes,
is
right.
Often cited but rarely explained. And so essentially what the Picard Maneuver does is that a ship will quickly jump to warp, but it will jump at such a short distance. When it engages its warp drive, it actually creates two images.
Right.
And it'll actually show up on sensors as two different ships, which will confuse an attacker in terms of who they should be going after. And this is actually what Picard uses with the Stargazer 9 years prior during the Battle of Maxia to defeat and ultimately escape from the Ferengi vessel he destroys. What did one thing that they talked about, and I really wanted to get your opinion on, was the Ferengi Thoughtmaker.
Mm-hmm.
And this will kind of be the last thing that we'll talk about.
Sure.
One thing that I don't think that we think about in 2021 really is the development of new weapon technologies. But I know in the 80s, it was a real subject of constant discussion, especially in the media. Coming out of, towards the end of the Cold War, there was still the worry of nuclear weapons. But around the world, we were starting to see things like chemical warfare, especially in the Middle East, with Saddam Hussein using Scud missiles to drop chemical payloads on Kuwaitis and his own people, and also Iranians, because he gave him the weapons. It seems like the Ferengi even have their own sense, and again, we're talking about how capitalism can weirdly be a positive thing. in a marketplace environment, sometimes you have to place restrictions on things, and it seems like the Ferengi react to the fact that Damon Bach's using a thought maker in a very negative way. Like when Picard holds it up on the bridge, Kazagos goes like, "What are you doing with that? That thing's illegal. You're not supposed to have that." And I just wanted to get your thoughts on like, when this episode's coming out, what is the conversation your generation is having about weapons and just the world around it?
I can remember back at that time that was about the time that the neutron bomb technology came up,
Mm-hmm.
where you would, uh, change the characteristics of a nuclear weapon so that it produced a heavy amount of neutrons coming from the blast that would not necessarily destroy structures, but it would kill biological materials, it would kill people. And that was kind of like, boy, that's pretty tough. And I mean, it's sort of like the ultimate personnel weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know where they stand in terms of START treaties, whether we or the Russians have those in inventory still. I can't think of anything like that. I mean, this whole thing about the thought device that the Ferengi had gets back a little bit to the discussion we had about, in the 24th century, understand human physiology related to pain, common
Right.
cold, things of that sort. It seems like the Federation or the humans did not have such a device, but Ferengi scientists had advanced to the point that they had something like that. And they realized that there were, there were just, practical and some sort of ethical problem, whatever their ethical standards were in using it. So they had basically outlawed it.
They came up with their own MAD.
Yeah. So, they put limits on, its use. It was illegal. And, I mean, it makes me think of, in terms of today, what was it a couple of years ago in several embassies. I read an article on this recently. It first showed up at the American Embassy in Havana, where a lot of the diplomatic staff were affected by these, microwaves or something like that.
Oh yeah.
That
So
caused. So
so what
and I.
happens is someone will take a truck or something like that, and they will put like this sounder microwave. I think it's a sound emitter.
Mm-hmm.
It's not actually microwaves. Um, well, it might be microwaves, but there's another one where like someone will put like a sound emitter into the back of like a truck, and they'll park in front of an embassy or a building, and they'll abandon the truck, but they'll turn on the emitter. And what the emitter does is that it'll send out this note that's essentially kind of silent to the human ear, but it's not. And what it does is make people sick, and it just drives it. It causes chaos, causes
Excuse me.
people to get ill and stuff like that. And that's a relatively new thing, but that's also something that that our current police actually have in terms of
Yeah.
we actually use a lot of sonic technology now to
The
do
the,
crowd
the
disbursements.
the military actually has that. I actually
Hmm.
somehow in Carborough, North Carolina, was going to try to find somebody for business and went into this one laboratory in Carborough, which is near Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina. And I don't know how, I can't remember, got the conversation, but this lab was actually work on sound devices for DARPA to control crowds
Yep.
in good old liberal Carborough, North Carolina, of all things.
Uh, well, as the Ferengi will tell you, money can make anything happen. Um,
Exactly. That's rule of acquisition number 121, probably.
one thing that I find very interesting is that one of the reasons the Ferengi kind of drift along with the Enterprise for 3 days is that it's very clear that um, Bach is setting up this device to affect Picard.
It may, now that you mention it, that might be the reason why the 3 days, because perhaps the way this device worked, it took time to change Picard's. I mean, how could they? We don't know, but they had to focus. The only human affected was Picard, so it had to have some cumulative effect to affect his neural circuitry, neural chemistry, whatever.
Well, one thing that I'm curious about is like, how did they tune it into like his basically how did they tune it into his brain waves? Like, how do you go about doing that? Because we talk about how in the future they have a way to map the brain now.
Right,
Is
right.
there a way to actually like tune into the frequency of a specific brain? It gets into the question like, in the mapping, did we discover that we each have a specific frequency to our neurology or something like that?
We all just have to make aluminum foil hats, I guess.
It's the only way we're going to defend ourselves.
Right.
But to close up on this, they have this really great scene where um, Riker is stuck fighting Picard, who has been brainwashed by Bach using the Thought Maker to take control of an automated Stargazer and face off against the Enterprise. And Picard, of course, is reenacting the Battle of Maxia, and he is going to go into the Picard Maneuver, which I've said before for the audience. You jump into warp at a short distance, and it creates two images on your opponent's sensor. And during that, hopefully they fire on the wrong image. And if they fire on the wrong image, that gives you time to fire back and hopefully destroy your enemy, like Picard does against Ferengis at Maxia. Um, Riker and Data figure out somehow that the gas exerted from the ship, where in terms of where it actually is how you detect which ship it is, and are able to get a tractor beam on him, and then convince Picard to destroy the Thought Maker that's on the bridge
Yes.
using his hand phaser, which I also find interesting. We don't actually ever know that a lot of these officers are carrying around these small phasers in their pockets. Um, but anyway, they destroy the Thought Maker. Um, I find this to actually be a really good scene without there being needing to be like phasers or torpedoes or anything like that. There's a lot of really good tension here. I was just
Hmm.
wondering what you thought about it, and then we'll end it here.
That was a very well put together dramatic scene where Riker. It goes back to what you said about the relationship that has been built between Picard and Riker. That Riker was able to convince Picard that something was going on and bring him back enough from the effects of the Thought Maker that he pulled out his weapon and destroyed it.
Yeah. Well, to close out, this is one of my favorite episodes of the first season. I don't know where it ranks so far with you, but the battle's just a really fun episode, and I think uses
It is.
The Ferengi really well. Um,
Yes.
well, we're gonna end it here tonight, folks. Jake, thank you for joining us,
Thank
and
you,
thank
Jay.
you
It
for
was
joining
fun.
me. And this has been great. We'll be back next time for Hide and Q, episode 10 of the first season of Star Trek: The Next Generation. See you all then.